the struggle becomes, the challenge for our society becomes, how do you create more meaningful roles for people of average ability? Why is it that we have a recruitment crisis in social care when it's such an important job, and it's a job that people enjoy doing? We just have to, raise its status and pay people more. I think it's still pretty unlikely that Nigel Farage will ever be Prime Minister, but you don't have to be Prime Minister, as he's already shown, to have an enormous amount of influence on other parties and politics more generally.
Do you run a business of any kind? Do you want 25% off up to 20 taxi rides? Well, if you sign up to Bulk Business with my promo code, that's exactly what you'll get. You don't have to use all 20 rides, and you can use it for your own business rides or for your employees. It couldn't be simpler. Follow the link in the description and use the code BB25OFF20 to get 25% off 20 taxi rides today. That's BB25OFF20. So, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today, I am delighted to be joined by David Goodhart, a journalist and think tanker from Policy Exchange, author of the new book, The Care Dilemma, Caring Enough in the Age of Sex Equality. Also author of one of my favorite books, The Road to Somewhere, and Head, Hand, Heart. So yeah, David, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So I think the best place to begin is for you to perhaps give people an overview of the trilogy of books that you've sort of put out into the world, and maybe some of the threads that connect them all.
Right, yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So in 2016, I sat down to write a book called The Road to Somewhere. You just mentioned it, where I talk about the education-based value divides that have disrupted our politics in recent times, that have led to Brexit, Trump 1 and Trump 2. And I coined these terms, the people that see the world from anywhere and the people that see the world from somewhere, and they kind of caught on and went into the political vocabulary a bit. I actually started writing the book just before the Brexit vote in 2016, and I finished writing it in November, just after the Trump victory in the 2016 US presidential election. So it was very well timed. It was, I guess it was a sort of an attempt at a sort of sympathetic understanding of what one might loosely call populism, of why people in apparently, rich, successful, free democratic societies, why so many people felt sufficiently pissed off that they did things like voting for Brexit and Trump, that the kind of the established elites found incomprehensible, and it was my attempt at an explanation. It came out relatively early in 2017, and so the timing was very good. People were looking around for a sort of general explanation for what had happened, and so it sold pretty well. It very briefly got into the bestseller list. It was
really?
It was at number 10 in the list for just 1 week, but that was enough to you can stick bestseller on the paperback edition. But anyway, just to explain the anywhere and somewhere difference in a little bit more detail. So, because the theme kind of runs through the subsequent two books to how society has got out of kilter in certain respects. I mean, we still live in very good societies. Most people on the planet would love to live in a country like the modern UK, but they didn't. At least if they come from the poorer world. But a lot of things have got out of kilter, and a lot of these things actually apply to similar countries to us. It's not a peculiarly UK thing. But so I talked about essentially the over-dominance of one worldview, the anywhere worldview. The anywhere worldview is the worldview of people who tend to be highly educated, and particularly in the UK, actually not even really the UK, particularly in England, that is often associated with mobility early in your life, because we have a residential university system, and it's an unusually high proportion of university students leave home and the place that the friends they grew up with and so on, move to often 200 miles away, different town, different city, and they sort of and they get used to that. Mobility is sort of part of their life story often, and with that sort of mobility, highly educated people mixing among themselves, you can see how certain what one might call sort of guardianish values and attitudes tend to get embedded in their worldview. That they tend to be relatively open. They tend to favour openness. They're not at all discomforted by mass immigration, say, but partly because they've sort of lost connection to particular places and groups of people. So that combination of sort of mobility and openness and comfort with change makes it very hard for them, I think, to understand the other large value group that I call the somewheres, who often feel very differently about these things. Now, anyways, I should say, I invented the labels, by the way. I didn't invent the value groups. I mean, I spent a lot of time with my nose in things like the British Social Attitude Surveys and opinion surveys. I mean, these groups really do exist out there. I mean, one can argue about the particular proportions that I attributed to them. I mean, I talked at the time about anywheres representing about 25-30% of the population. Somewheres maybe more like 45-50%, and there's quite a big, what I called in-betweener group. I mean, people who sort of share quite a lot of both worldviews. So the somewheres, who are a majority but much less vocal in our society, much less powerful in our society, tend to be less well educated, tend to place much greater attachment to the places they come from, the groups they belong to, and therefore are much more prone to feel discomforted by rapid change wherever it comes from. It might be the gentrification of the place they live, or it might be the fact that suddenly the streets fill up with people who look differently to them or speak a different language or whatever. So they're not necessarily xenophobic. No doubt some are, but it's just discomfort with change, a preference for the familiar, which is a pretty strong human trait after all, and obviously a lot of anywheres share that too in many respects, although their sort of professed ideology sort of cuts against it. And actually, one of the useful, I borrowed this term from the American sociologist Talcott Parsons, who talked about our identities being on a spectrum between achieved and ascribed. That all of us have a combination of the two, but anywheres tend to have a sense of themselves which derives in large part from their own achievements. They've done well at school, they've gone to a more or less good university, they have a more or less successful professional career, and that, by the way, is part of the problem in a way with the anywhere domination of our society, that progress through life has come to be seen as the sort of ideal type. And for many people, it's either not desired or not possible to achieve. So kind of where does that leave them? But anyway, so the anywheres have an identity which skews towards the achieved end of the spectrum, while the somewheres tend to have a worldview that is more skewed towards the ascribed, meaning that their sense of themselves comes from things about them that are probably pretty immutable. You're a white male working class Geordie, say. Most of those things you cannot change about yourself, and your sense of yourself is more firmly built on those immutable aspects of your background than anywhere. And I should emphasise that both of these worldviews, at least in their mainstream form, there is a xenophobic end of the somewheres, and there's a sort of citizens of nowhere end of the anywheres. But in their mainstream form, both of these worldviews are perfectly decent. The problem is, in our society, and the problem that has created the kind of backlash, the populist backlash, the Brexits, the Trumps, is the fact that one of them is over-dominant, particularly the last sort of 25, 30 years or so. And I think what you've seen is a kind of merger of, particularly since the huge expansion of higher education in the UK and most other comparable countries in the last 20 or 30 years, a kind of merger of the cognitive meritocracy, if you like, the people with high cognitive ability, the sort of the ability to process information easily, essentially a kind of IQ type exam passing intelligence. Those people from whatever background have merged in, as I see it, with the more established elites. Those established elites have also become very adept at getting their children through the sort of cognitive meritocracy, over that hurdle, often with the help of private schools or private tutors or whatever, even if they're of only average intelligence. So you've had, and I think this crosses centre left and centre right. I mean, certainly the anywhere over domination of our politics, you could see it just as much, say, in New Labour, indeed perhaps rather more in something like a phenomenon like New Labour. I mean, it was Tony Blair, after all, who made that famous and I think rather disastrous speech in 1999 saying that 50% of school leavers should go to university. And it was clear nobody in Tony Blair's entourage, people in the education world who were helping him write that speech, had any sense that their own children might be in the 50% and were not going to university. And I think there is a kind of one of our political problems has been a kind of lack of emotional intelligence, a lack of empathy on the part of anywheres to understand. They've been far too easy. I think it may be receding a bit now, but far too easy to reach for the kind of racism, nativist, xenophobic button when people are expressing essentially, mainstream somewhere assumptions about the importance of the nation state, or wanting immigration to be kept to moderate levels. The importance of the distinction between the citizen and non-citizen. I think one of the things that was particularly offended people about free movement, wasn't just, say, competition in the labour market or extra pressure on public resources, public infrastructure. Although that was part of it, I think it was the idea that you could come here and from day one have all the rights of a UK citizen, bar voting in national elections, or serving on juries, a few trivial things. And I think that sort of sense that you didn't sort of earn your sense of citizenship was particularly offensive. But anyway, a whole range of policies that were that were essentially designed, again, whether it was a centre-left government or a centre-right government, policies that were designed for people of high cognitive ability or people who were already part of a kind of established elite, and some of this sort of you could say reinforces a kind of left-right argument, and some of the more traditional social class arguments, the kind of things that animated politics for most of the post-war period. But some of these things created a new sort of cultural divides that often disparagingly described as sort of authoritarian versus liberal, open versus closed. Tony Blair used to like talking about open versus closed. And to which my response is, I've never met anybody who wants to live in a closed society, but a lot of people felt that the forms of openness that had evolved, from the kind of globalization period onwards, from the kind of late 80s, early 90s onwards, that the forms of openness were not serving their interest. And anyway, just moving on from The Road to Somewhere, my next book kind of reinforced one of the arguments in The Road to Somewhere, which was about the overvaluing, Head, Hand, Heart, the book, The Struggle for Dignity and Status in the 21st Century, was about the overvaluing, it's a sort of anywhere bias, the overvaluing of that one form of sort of analytical cognitive ability, important though it is, of course. We need clever people. I'm not against clever people. We need elites. We need hierarchies. I'm not an anarchist. And we need open elites. One of the things that we rightly focus on a lot is the degree of openness of the elite. And by the way, I think our elite is a lot more open than is often assumed. I'm very encouraged by the way that the private state balance has, rather kind of unacknowledged, has shifted very, very significantly towards state. If you take key institutions like Oxbridge, as a sort of forcing house for the future elite, we've gone back and I think now even exceeded the kind of state-private balance that we had back in the grammar school era in the 50s and 60s. So I think it's now Oxford. I think Cambridge is slightly ahead of Oxford, but it's like sort of 75 to 80% state, 20-25% private. Oxford, I think, lags a little bit behind that. And look at Parliament itself. I mean, Parliament, even the last Tory government, the proportion of privately educated people in Parliament was something like 25%. Now, you might say that's still hugely unrepresentative, although we also have this slightly misleading statistic that only 6 or 7% of the population go to private school. That's the population of private schools at any one time. The actual proportion of the population who will spend some significant time at a private school is more like 15, 18%, even a bit higher, I think, in London. So anyway, that's a slight parenthesis, but I think we actually have achieved a more open elite than the UK is often given credit for, and obviously that is a good thing. However, I do think we have overemphasized, as I say, that a narrow form of cognitive analytical ability, and without intending to, we have made people who do not make the cut. I mean, we've just moved, in a sense, the sort of brutality of the old 11 plus at the age of 11 to the age of 16, where if you don't get sufficiently good GCSEs, you don't get into the A-level stream. If you don't get into the A-level stream, you don't go to university. If you don't go to university, you are faced with what is still a very, very poor set of options. I mean, the last Tory government did think and create a fair amount of policy in the area of apprenticeships and vocational education, although none of it has been sufficient, as it were, to sort of turn the tanker. So it's much more complex. You get much less financial support. Even with tuition fees for undergraduates, that we still subsidise higher education on a dramatically larger scale than we do vocational education. Now, I mean, some of that is perfectly reasonable. A lot of the funding, a lot of the investments going into research. Unlike, say, Germany or Austria, we tend to do all of our research in universities. We don't have the kind of research institutes that Germany has. But nonetheless, there is a huge bias. There's a bias in the education system. Schools are rewarded for the number of children they send to Russell Group universities. Our view of social mobility in recent years has all been about somebody from a preschool meal in a city, disadvantaged background, getting to Oxford or Cambridge. Now, brilliant though that is, that should not be the central focus of social mobility. As I said, we already have a relatively open elite. What we should be focusing on is raising the general level of capability of the whole population, and thinking a lot harder about the kind of training, the kind of learning by doing that so many people, particularly young men, thrive in environments where, often young men aren't very good at sitting still and concentrating. Their brains, the relevant part of their brains, develop a bit later than girls. Just one of the reasons why girls are absolutely smashing it in the modern, more kind of academic, knowledge economy focused education system. And a lot of boys are getting left behind. But I have a little story in the Head, Hand, Heart about a friend of mine, a guy called Paul Corby from Huddersfield. He actually rose to become very prominent in the trade union movement. He was at one point Deputy General Secretary of the building union, UCAT. He comes from Huddersfield. He left school. He failed his 11 plus, went to a secondary modern, learned absolutely nothing, no maths or geometry or algebra. Pretty chaotic. I guess this would have been in the late 50s, early 60s. But he left school at 15, did a 5-year construction apprenticeship with a local house builder. And, within a few months of leaving school, he was using Pythagoras' theorem to work out the angles to lay foundations for multi-million-pound houses and office blocks. I mean, and it was easy. And that anyway, I mean, that just sort of makes the point about, learning. And we've stopped all, many of the kind of manual technical things that used to be taught to kids in schools, because this is my point about the kind of merger of the meritocratic elite with the established elites, that the meritocratic elite has sort of said, look, I did the equivalent of passing the 11 plus, so kind of why can't you? It sort of assumes everybody is above average.
Yeah.
It's one of the greatest sort of naiveties of modern liberalism in a way. And it ends up being cruel.
Yeah.
And inappropriate, and it fails us economically. So we're hugely overproducing people with kind of low-level academic qualifications that prepare them really for very little, except perhaps to become regulators. I do think part of the kind of expansion of the bureaucratic class is that we produce people and we need to provide them with roles. And compliance officer, why are we strangling in regulation? I mean, I think it's at least part of the story, because we're overproducing people who are not capable of doing anything else.
Yeah, we've kind of changed the definition of success in a way.
Yeah, yeah. But meanwhile, we have huge shortages of very few people who are doing the kind of higher technical qualifications, level 4, level 5, and so on. Now, you could say that it's partly because there isn't sufficient demand from employers for those kinds of roles. I mean, it is a complex argument. I'm aware of that. So that it's creating a kind of an economic problem, and it's one of the reasons why the employers were so happy to have free movement from Europe to fill a lot of those sorts of higher technical roles. The Polish plumber. And if we want to, we have a massive shortage of skilled construction workers. We talk non-stop now about building more houses, but who's actually going to build them? I mean, they're going to have to relax the immigration rules again to bring in the skilled construction workers. Now, construction is a slightly special case because it's so cyclical. The incentive for a young man or woman to invest in kind of higher level construction skills is quite limited, but it is also the fault of our institutions, I think, that the incentives are so poor. So it's an economic problem, but it's also a social and political and cultural problem. So I think, going back to the famous Tony Blair speech, that we did achieve the 50% of school leavers going on to college, although it was skewed towards young women. I think it's more than a half of young women now go to university in the UK, and only a bit more than a third of young men. So there is a gender gap there. But the when 10 or 15% of people in your school, your class, your town, people go to university and you don't, who cares? I mean, it's the clever people have their special place, and that's fine. And the majority of people of average ability go on, work in the local offices or factories, and life goes on. But when 50% go, and you're not in that 50%, then it's if many people are going to start seeing themselves as kind of second-class citizens, it's going to, it's bad for their morale. Given how much of the culture focuses on that academic stream and that academic path to university, and I think that's what's happened. So, and not only that, not only have you kind of implicitly told nearly half of the population that they're second class, with the mass over expansion of higher education, you're also producing a hierarchy within the system, so that if you don't now get into a Russell Group university, the graduate income premium has now shrunk dramatically. I think it's more than a third of graduates are not in graduate employment, 10 years after graduating. So you're also creating a sort of lumpen intelligentsia, as it were, to use a kind of old Marxist phrase. And I do think there's a sort of connection between lots of kids, often perhaps from working class backgrounds, first in their family to go to university. They've worked hard, they've done what their parents and their teachers have said. They've worked hard and they've got there, and they've come out with a 2-1 from a not very good university in social sciences or humanities or whatever, and they're not moving into the high status, highly paid professional occupations that they thought they would be. They're in a 25 grand sort of back office job of some kind, probably about to be replaced by AI. And I suspect I don't know this for certain, but I think it's a reasonable assumption. It's such people that are the sort of shock troops, particularly of kind of left-wing populism, of the kind of, Corbynistas, the Bernie Sanders movement, I suspect were often sort of, educated people in the sense that they'd been to university, but people without, and of course you've got the whole sort of problem with housing, the fact that they leave university with large debts. They don't have the kind of university experience that I had as a baby boomer, when you were still pretty well assured, when the kind of professional class was still expanding. This, of course, is one of the reasons for the sense that social mobility has slowed down, is the fact that there's less room at the top. We had a huge expansion of professional jobs, partly public sector professional jobs, all the teachers and university lecturers and doctors that were needed when the welfare state, the social state, was expanding in the 60s and 70s. That can't go on forever, and it probably is. There probably is still some expansion at the top, but it's much, much less than it was. So people sort of compare that sense that, particularly, if you'd gone to university in the 60s, 70s, 80s, you were kind of more or less guaranteed that relatively high status, relatively high paid job, and that ceased to be the case. So I think it's an economic problem, the overexpansion, the kind of head hand, the overvaluation of the kind of academic intelligence, and of course along with that goes the undervaluation of the people with practical capabilities and emotional intelligence, and perhaps that actually leads on to my current book, The Care Dilemma, the Caring Enough in the Age of Sex Equality is the subtitle, and it's sort of building on the argument in Head, Hand, Heart, that the undervaluing of the domestic realm and the family, and the face-to-face care jobs in the public care economy, and to put it grandly, this is the sort of the third in my kind of Anywhere critique trilogy, because Anywhere people tend to be very public realm, very career, very professional, career success oriented people, and of course there's nothing wrong with that. I've been like that in my life. I understand and appreciate that, and we need ambitious, energetic, clever people to run institutions and come up with all the sort of the technical solutions that we need to solve our climate change and other problems. But in the process, I think we have again we've got things out of kilter. It's sort of, to put it more philosophically, it's a sort of tension between freedom and meaning. That I think the Anywhere liberalism tends towards a sense of freedom as lack of constraint, and it kind of, there's a sort of bias against the sort of obligations, the sort of long-term commitments that you need to make family life work well, but basically it's freedom versus the investment in the care that we say we want for the care that involves having the babies that we say we want. There is a fertility gap between the number of children young women are having and the number of children they say they want. It's quite a big gap. It would, if young women had the number of babies that they say they want, we'd be close to replacement. We'd be close to back up to kind of 2, 2.1.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
It's like half. So we're now 1.4, just 1.4. It's like half a child is the gap. And that half child would take us back up to 2. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for being a bit sceptical about the surveys that ask people. Obviously, people's views change. You know, you thought you wanted 2 children, you had 1, and you find you were happy with 1. Other things in your life kind of came along and made 2 tricky. You're not unhappy about it. Or you may end up childless. Now, a lot of people are unintentionally childless, but some people are intentionally childless. But anyway, it's freedom versus the investment that we say we want in having and looking after babies properly, looking after those disabled people of working age, and also, of course, the growing army of the elderly. 5 million people over 75 in the UK, 2.5 million over 85. That's a lot of people that need a lot of care, and we are not having the babies now that will be the young people that might look after them in 30 years' time. But I mean, I look more broadly at the various social ills that I think come from insufficient investment in the family and the domestic realm more broadly. And I talk about how the unstable family. I think people are not really aware of just what a mess our families are in this country, and we are international, aren't we? Certainly European outliers in the instability in family life, particularly in the bottom half of the income spectrum, which is perhaps one of the reasons why the public discourse does not recognise it enough, because actually the people that run our country and run the media and dominate our culture still come from relatively stable families. But much of the rest of the population doesn't. Nearly half of children in the UK are not living with both of their biological parents at the age of 14. Nearly 25% of families are families with dependent children. Nearly 25% are single-parent families, which is nearly double the average across the rest of Europe. It's about 13%, I think. And that alone, I think, is connected to a huge number of social problems. I mean, look, the criminal justice system is completely clogged up with people from unhappy, broken family backgrounds. Educational underperformance. The housing problem. For family breakup contributes enormously to the extra demand for housing that we're incapable of satisfying, etc., etc. Poverty. I mean, one of the reasons why we are a society with a relatively high degree of poverty, again by European standards anyway, and relatively high in inequality. The reason why we are one of the big countries, probably the most unequal in Europe, is a combination of having a very big financial sector and having a very big single parent population. Single parents are invariably a very high proportion of them are in poverty, in relative poverty at least, and the mental fragility crisis among young people. I mean, obviously, I'm aware of the work of Jonathan Haidt and other people on the social media and the iPhone, and how damaging it can be, particularly for young girls, to be curating their lives on TikTok or whatever. And I think he makes a very good case for that being an important part of the deterioration in the mental health of a lot of young people, particularly, it seems, in the Anglosphere countries and Scandinavia, maybe less so in continental Europe. But what sort of step. I mean, I think the elephant in the room there is, why are these kids spending so much time on their screens in the first place? It's often because the family life is not stable. They're not having, even at the weekend, family meals together, and there isn't the kind of parental investment in them that they need to keep them off their screens. Their parents are all on their screens as well. So I think you've got the whole kind of weaker family as a result of our promotion of our own freedoms in some way as adults. And this is this is not just about we also, because the family is much less stable and more dispersed, and there are many people who would in previous generations have been looking after their old people who are not any longer. The state or the market is looking after their old people. So that means that again more pressure on the public purse. So we have a kind of constant increase in the social state, partly as a function of the weaker family. Less is done in the family, more care work has to be done in the market and the state. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But we also have a falling fertility rate that I touched on earlier, and we have a recruitment crisis in face-to-face care jobs. Jobs that used to have a sort of captive market of women mainly. A lot of these lowish status care jobs are very, very heavily female majority. Like nursing is 89% female, social care is about 80% female, primary school about 85% female, nursery care obviously even higher, about 97% female, I think. And because women are freer to do other things, this is why some of this argument is about what I call the care dilemma, that you've had. So a lot of these negative trends are the other side, the flip side, if you like, of very positive trends. The movement of women from the kind of this huge movement from the 1950s through to the 1990s, it's sort of stabilized more or less since then, of women from the domestic realm, but from being full-time stay-at-home mothers often, then becoming part-time, balancing family and part-time work, and now increasingly, even when children are preschool, more than a third of mothers with preschool children are working full-time, and this is not very popular. A lot of those mothers would prefer not to be working full-time, at least when children are preschool. Some are very happy with that. But anyway, you've had this huge movement of women from the main focus of their energies and have been in the domestic sphere, and it's now much more kind of balance between jobs and often very very high status professional jobs. And obviously a lot of energy has rightly gone into making sure that obviously society has benefited hugely from this shift. We have access to the brains and energy of women in a way that we didn't have 50 years ago, and that's obviously an unmitigated good. But we also have there's an accounting sleight of hand in the way that we kind of measure these things. So we only see the increased GDP. Obviously, the movement of women into the GDP economy has enormously boosted GDP, along with the kind of white goods industries that we're also then required to as it were replace the female labour in the home, and that's seen as a kind of unmitigated good. The increased incomes to households and to women themselves, and of course it also gave women financial independence. I mean, something that was absolutely necessary in a world where morals had liberalized. So marriages were no longer as secure as they had been. Unhappy or oppressive partnerships it was possible to dissolve from the sort of 70s and 80s onwards. We had a huge increase in separations and divorce, and to survive in a more unstable world of relationships, women needed to be financially independent. So all of those are absolutely essential. and indeed, you could say this that movement of women into paid employment was sort of accompanied by equality legislation and so on, has been the biggest step forward in human freedoms, certainly since 1945 in rich countries like ours. But we don't focus enough on the fact that women were not doing nothing in the home before this great shift. And that's why I call it a kind of a cant and sleight of hand. And okay, so one of the sort of standard arguments, or sort of feminist argument you might say, is, well, men have got to step up. And I would say, yes, I think that is true. And men, I'd say, are stepping up actually more than that is generally acknowledged in the, at least in the kind of domestic realm, in the family. I mean, if all these time use surveys suggest that we've moved from a balance of kind of women and men in the domestic and childcare field. We've moved from about 70-30 to something more like 60-40, even 55-45, probably in more highly educated homes. So the challenge is, we've had all these negative trends from the kind of withdrawal of investment, you might say, in the domestic realm and the family. Much of that withdrawal, or that sort of shifting, is a beneficial thing, and therefore, this is, and the dilemma is, how do we raise the status of the sort of traditionally female realm in a way? How do we raise the status of care, both in the home and in the public care economy, without in any way kind of reversing the freedoms that women and men have enjoyed in recent decades? And I have various ideas in the book for how we do that. I mean, I do think that one of the we should make it easier for one parent, probably usually the mother, but probably also increasingly the father, to stay at home when children are preschool. All the surveys say that if women had the arrangements, if money was an OSU, their ideal arrangements were available to them, then instead of having only about 20% of women who are full-time mothers in that 0 to 4 period of infancy, instead of 20%, it would be more like 40% or even higher. I mean, the Department for Education itself does these surveys asking women about childcare, and something like 2/3 of women who are working full-time would prefer to work fewer hours, and 1/3 would prefer to not work at all if they could afford it. And one of the proposals I make, I haven't gone into the policy detail of this, and there clearly would be some hurdles to overcome, but we spend currently £9 billion on childcare subsidies. Why not give that? And yet everybody still complains about the relatively high cost of childcare in most parts of the country.
That's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money. Why not give it direct to families with young children? They then have the choice to either spend it as now on nursery care, so that both mother and father, by the way, both mother and father working full-time when children are preschool is the preference, according to British social attitude surveys, of 9% of the population. This is not a popular situation that we're in.
This is something I wanted to ask a lot about, because I think it was Elizabeth Warren, the American senator. She wrote the book, The Two-Income Trap.
That's right, yeah. Pocahontas.
Pocahontas, yeah. But the point she makes basically in the book is that with women becoming a major part of the workforce and all of the attendant benefits that you laid out that come along with that, we've also sort of found that slowly the amount required to function as a household, like salary wise, has increased as the sort of combined salary of the household has increased. That the economic cost of having kids in a household has risen, whilst the
it's partly to do with housing costs, and there is an argument. Some people say you might sort of old-fashioned Labour people might say, well, the old family income has been eroded by employers. But employers have sort of taken advantage of that big shift of women into the labour market. Actually, if you look at what was happening in the 50s and 60s, when in the 1960s, you saw the fastest growth of incomes, working class incomes included, in this country ever. So I don't think it was. I mean, it was partly there was a sort of the opposite of a virtuous circle on housing costs. So as more women started to go out to work, their household income increased, which meant that they could bid higher for desirable housing, which then sort of forced other women to go out to compete for housing. I mean, it was also because women wanted to go out and needed financial autonomy in a world of less certain relationships.
But I guess my question is basically, is the disparity between that stat, like 9% of people would prefer both parents to be working, is that out of economic necessity, do you think?
Well, a mix. I mean, I think, it's mainly economic necessity, given what people tell the opinion pollsters when asked about their ideal arrangements. I mean, who is it? Catherine Hakim is a sociologist who looked at these issues a few years back now, and she talked about British women being divided 20-20-60. So 20% British women are very career and work focused. It doesn't mean to say they don't want children too, but very career and work focused. Perhaps in quite high paying professional jobs. Would be back at work, 3 months or 6 months after having a baby, expressing milk and so on. Another 20% are very family focused and would, in almost any circumstances, would prefer to be a stay-at-home mother, at least for most of their children's childhoods. But then 60% are the so-called adaptive women who want to combine the two, but at least when children are very young, are somewhat more family focused than the very career focused women. And I think that's probably, just from sort of looking around the people I know and so on, that kind of strikes me as being, and indeed from opinion surveys, that strikes me as being a kind of reasonable way of putting it. And but our public policy does not at all reflect the preferences of women, and that, of course, is partly because the women who tend to dominate in the public realm and who dominate the policy debate tend to be the 20% who are very, very kind of work and career focused, and that's and we've made a decent amount of progress in improving childcare, making it possible for women to both be mothers and successful in the professional sphere. But there's a very large, probably majority of women whose voices we hardly ever hear, who would be who would much prefer to have a home care. So I mean, I calculated that if you did give that £9 billion direct to parents, if you also front-ended child benefit, if you have two children, it's what's sort of getting on for $2,000 a year. If you and it goes on for 20 years. If you have children in education after 16, I think it is. If you gave that, if you front-ended that, give half of that in the first 3 or 5 years, rather than spreading it out where later on when you need it less. And if you also recognise the family and the tax system, which we don't do, and again, we're international outliers in that, you could come, I reckon, to a home care allowance of about $10,000 a year. And that would be the difference between being able to stay at home and not for a lot of families, I think. And the stress, the reduction in stress, I think far more relationships would survive that very, very difficult period, high stress period, when people first have a young child or young children. Their old life has gone. They're suddenly home focused, and and they're at work, and often the demands of work, they're in their late 20s, early 30s, they're often sort of climbing up the greasy pole. I mean, these, I think now we have to make sure that time taken out by a woman, or maybe increasingly a man, it's unavoidable that there would be some parenthood penalty. It's obviously usually a motherhood penalty. There's, you can't completely eliminate it, but we should work as hard as possible to reduce that, so that people could take, 5 years out, 7 years out, and return, at a similar kind of level. Obviously, people would, need to have your skills freshened up and so on. But, and I think a lot of work has gone, rightly has gone into that. But we have absolutely, the woman the mother who would actually like to stay at home is a sort of invisible figure in our culture. And that shouldn't be the case.
Yeah. So it actually comes to sort of a thing about freedom in the way that you talked about. And I really wanted to ask about this because, so you talked about this, that there's a tension in a way between like freedom and meaning. And I wanted to ask, do you think that people, you've talked about how we're more free in the 21st century in a sense, and that a lot of the things that are happening are as consequence of that greater freedom. But I'm not 100% convinced that we are more free in the 21st century, in 2024, than we were, say, 30 years ago. Like, for example, and I think that freedom has eroded meaning for a lot of people, because that freedom meant, okay, we go to university, like 50% of a generation now, almost, give or take. And then, okay, we go into university, we get a degree, we come out, we end up mostly in a corporate job, say in London, where you'll begin on minimum wage. You're on 24k in London. That gets you nothing. You're scraping by. You're sat in front of a screen all day. Your job is sending emails, and you've spent 3 years educating yourself for a bunch of debt and the ability to send emails. And I've been in that position. I'm lucky at the minute. I've got quite a job I enjoy, but I know a lot of people whose job is literally just sending emails. If you're not in that, if you're not in that 20% of people whose technical ability is really thriving in the modern economy,
and who take decisions, whose judgment and abilities are sort of actually used.
Or say software engineers or programmers, and people who can still be creative within that. So do you?
No, I think that's right. I was actually listening to, is it Paul Dolan's podcast? You know who I mean? He was interviewing. It was about class, actually. He was interviewing an upper class woman who'd become a plumber in Glasgow. But it was actually, that
might be better paid than a lot. Well, no,
but she said, the satisfaction of going into somebody's house, solving their plumbing problem. You get, and obviously, you have to use your intelligence and your manual capabilities. I mean, back to Paul Corby and the Pythagoras' theorem, but also lots of these face-to-face care jobs. They're at the bottom of the income spectrum. They're at the top, close to the top of the job satisfaction spectrum. All of the surveys suggest, you can just seeing, and I, as you say, compared to spending a day in an overheated office just sending emails, which is heartbreaking. I mean, I mean, freedom. I mean, I'm not a philosopher, but I do think, that our definition of freedom. And this is one of the kind of weaknesses of modern liberalism, of what I call sort of anywhere liberalism, is the idea that freedom is lack of constraint, and that is not sufficient. I mean, obviously, we don't want to go back to the Victorian era or even the 1950s. I mean, the huge, the kind of constraints on people were too tightly bound then, and we had the 60s and the 70s. We had the great era of freedom and indeed of equality, of race equality, gender equality, and so no politics. I mean, even the populist parties, I think, mainly accept the sort of what one might call the 1945 sort of welfare settlement and the sort of 60s, 70s equality settlement, but which is not to say that all of the products of those two settlements should be set in stone forever. You shouldn't necessarily always have an NHS that is free at point of use. Insurance systems do seem to work pretty well elsewhere, but I've lost my thread. How do we get onto that?
We're talking about meaning and being a corporate drone, basically.
Yeah. So, the kind of freedom as lack of constraint. You're left with, an over-individualistic sort of idea. That this, well-off professionals sitting on their own in a flat in London, sending emails all day. They may have friends. Increasingly, they are unlikely to be a mother or father. Something that does give you purpose, difficult though it is. And this is, we were talking earlier about. I think one of the ways that this Care Dilemma book sort of connects to my previous two books is the sense that one of the roles, that we. Because of this merger between the kind of cognitive meritocracy and the more established elites, and as I've already mentioned, the idea that so many of our institutions, so many of our educational institutions are successful businesses, tend to be professional and financial services. You've got to have not just a good degree, you've got to sort of have a high level of cognitive ability to function well in these. In these functions, and that means that lots of other, probably the majority of the population are kind of left behind, and so that the struggle becomes, the challenge for our society becomes, how do you create more meaningful roles for people of average ability, and I think the obvious thing to say, you do that by kind of raising the pay and status of a lot of those jobs that don't require academic qualifications, but are absolutely essential. We saw that in the pandemic. What were the key workers?
We can see it right now. I think with this weird vilification of farmers. It confuses me no end. It's
no, but I do think I think parenting is one role that we've sort of largely abandoned in one. Well, we've seen it as, belonging or, mothering. We've seen it sort of somehow belonging to women's past, not their future. The same with those sort of face-to-face care jobs. Why have we not sorted out the social care issue? I don't mean so much how it's paid for and what the contribution of the individual should be and what the contribution of the state should be, although that's obviously a big question too. But it's more, why is it that we have a recruitment crisis in social care when it's such an important job and it's a job that people enjoy doing? We just have to, raise its status and pay people more. One of the suggestions I make is that we should actually have a kind of higher level social care worker, an enhanced care practitioner, I think it's called, somebody who can do minor medical interventions. They obviously need to be trained more, and not in a university. Just a day off or a few weeks off. Every few weeks to learn the basics of wound care in an FE college or somewhere. That could save the system billions too. There's huge demarcation disputes in social care between the kind of professional and non-professional staff. But sorry, that's a bit of a detour. Just to finish on the sort of freedom and meaning question. I do think this connection between the Care Dilemma and my previous books. One of them is the fact that being a parent is something is something that you can that ordinary people can do. Not everybody can be a decent parent, but most people can be a decent parent, and it is very hard, possibly harder than it used to be, for all sorts of reasons to do in the modern world. And most people can be a decent parent in the way that most people cannot be a decent brain surgeon or even a decent corporate lawyer. And I think that's another reason for kind of investing more in the family and the domestic realm. And these are hugely difficult issues, and there are, it would be expensive to do some of the things I've talked about. Although some of it is, you could just redirect current spending flows, but there are trade-offs with freedom. I mean, I think one of the reasons, if you sort of take your average young woman in Britain today, particularly if she's part of the 50% plus that are now going to university, she's average, perhaps slightly above average kind of academic ability, goes to university, maybe does some kind of subsequent degree, takes an MA or something, because an ordinary degree is sort of isn't enough these days for a lot of fancy careers, and then starts in her career, say in the law or accountancy or whatever, and needs to get established, before even thinking about having a child. And obviously that depends on having a decent, reliable partner, which is also, for all sorts of other reasons, perhaps increasingly difficult. But you suddenly look around and you're 31, even before you start thinking about it. And also, your life has been essentially the same as a young man's, in a way that, going back generations, your life would never have been the same as a young man in that period. And so you've sort of tasted the joys of freedom in some ways. You enjoy a very high level of autonomy, precisely equivalent to a young man's, really. And the idea of giving that up is much riskier now. So you can live as a young woman, you live perhaps 15 years of your life with your own income. You have your own flat, or maybe you share it with people. You have that, and then suddenly you're being asked to, there's nothing that makes you less free than having a baby. And nothing that makes you more dependent on other people than having a baby. And that people are very, given the zeitgeist, people are very attached to freedom and very, very wary of dependence.
I think that's very accurate. Do you think we're past like a peak anywhere / peak head in terms of, like, do you think we've reached a point where there's like a resurgence of desire for like in the hand and the heart and the somewhere-ness that, like, in a lot of ways sort of comes hand in hand with that, like the being rooted somewhere in a community, surrounded by people that you have long, deep roots with, and work in a job that's maybe not as prestigious, but something more like deeply satisfying, perhaps. Do you think there's like a resurgence of that coming, or underway?
Yeah, obviously I would hope so. I think at the superficial political level, the story since the Brexit referendum has not been a particularly encouraging one in this country. We spent 3 years trying to reverse it. This is not exactly...
No, there's still people trying to reverse it. I hear from them every day on Twitter.
Right. That is not an anywhere class feeling admonished. Although I think that some of them were. Actually, Theresa May was a sort of admonished anywhere, and actually, I think that partly accounted for the missteps that she took. She was probably overcompensating for the fact that she'd been a Remainer. Sorry. I think at other levels, I think the populist pressure is quite useful in a way on the kind of anywhere classes. The fact that Trump turned out not to just be a flash in the pan.
He's more popular than ever.
Yeah. The fact that, we now have a three-party system with Reform, not with the Lib Dems. Labour, Tories and Reform are all in the low 20s now in the opinion polls.
It's a stunning turnaround from, say, 18 months ago.
Yeah. And I think that does put, I think it's still pretty unlikely that Nigel Farage will ever be Prime Minister, but you don't have to be Prime Minister, as he's already shown, to have an enormous amount of influence on other parties and politics more generally. So I think, the sort of more, that what I've called the kind of missing majority that are a bit to the, that are kind of market social democrats, if you like, in economics. They're a bit to the left of centre on economics, which I don't think necessarily precludes, quite a deregulator. We've got a Labour government that is talking about deregulation all the time. I mean, obviously the right kind of deregulation to allow us to build more houses and so on. But so a little bit to the centre, left of centre economically, and quite a long way, actually, relative to the Westminster bubble anyway, quite a long way to the right of centre on social and cultural issues, which is kind of where, this is the missing majority that populist parties often sort of represent, sometimes in a rather, in a slightly ugly way. And I think that pressure to sort of find a way through to achieve these kinds of things. And I think there are one or two things, that, we saw in the pandemic. The pandemic,
unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up. I didn't realise how long we've been talking. Right. Do you want to finish your thought really quickly?
I was going to say that, it's possible you don't have to live... It's possible to sort of to live more dispersed. Like, we don't all have to live in big metropolitan centres, the towns, the smaller towns, even the countryside can sort of flourish more, where life is a bit slower and less stressed, and perhaps slightly more kind of small c conservative, because we can work from anywhere now thanks to these machines, and that might help to move away from the sort of helter skelter of the high stress, no baby life in the big city.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we have to cut it off there. David, it was an absolute pleasure. Everyone can go back to the book, the Care Dilemma. Thanks very much. Right. Absolute pleasure. I'll put links for all your stuff in the description. People can find you, your books, etc. And yeah, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Hey, listeners, real quick. Do you ever find yourself sitting watching the stock market like this? Well, now you could instead be ordering my book like this. It's the story of GameStop. You can purchase it with a hoodie, with acknowledgements, or just with the early backers edition. It's all about the GameStop story. It's the real story, not just what you've seen on films. It's exactly what has happened over the last 3.5 years. And with DFE back, I'm finally able to draw a conclusion to my book. Please pre-order it. It really helps me out, and you will get it eventually, I promise. Hopefully this year.